Again, here's our building blocks of progress, the role of the IEP. So again, this is for people new to special education, new to the IEP process, people that are maybe general educators who want to know more about the IEP and special education process, or if you're going to support those people, this will be a good place to get some more information and get some good resources to take back to staff. While y'all keep adding in who you are and where you're from, let us introduce ourselves. I'll go first, and I'll let Amy and Riley introduce themselves as well. So I'm Stephen Prater. I'm the Intensive Technical Assistance Lead for the Progress Center, and that means the Intensive Technical Assistance team. That we were the team that worked directly with schools and districts to provide training and coaching and things like that. So that was our role with the Progress Center. So I'll let Amy introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. If you were in the main session with us already, you got a chance to meet me, but I am Amy Peterson. I lead the Universal Technical Assistance for the Progress Center, which basically means all of the freely available resources, materials that are available on the website, as well as events such as this one. Really excited to have you all here with us. We're going to share a lot of resources and materials. If you ever have questions about those resources, you want to talk through anything, you have questions about accessing them, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to address those. As Tessie mentioned, I also lead out work and act as the Deputy Director for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Oh, no problem, Christine. Feel free to jump to a different strand if you guys are in the wrong sessions. Again, this is the IEP basics one. We'll go over the IEP as well as support you in thinking about kind of whether or not the IEP or how to support others in thinking about the IEP as well. So I'll turn it to Riley.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Riley O'Donnell, and I am a technical assistance provider with the Progress Center. I've been fortunate enough to work very close with both Stephen and Amy on the intensive and universal teams. So again, thanks for joining us.
All right. So as you're joining, keep putting in where you're from, what your role is. But we also want to know this about you. Like, why did you choose to join this session today? So if you see at the top of your toolbar, you should have something about, I believe it's at the top, about where you can annotate. So if you want to choose a symbol to annotate and you can place it directly on your screen about which of these reasons is why you chose to join this session today. Either you're new to special education, or supporting students with disabilities, you're interested in a refresher on the IEP, you're looking for resources to share about the IEP, you're responsible for training or supporting staff for families that are new to the IEP, or any other reason why, and if you want to put that in chat. If you can't figure out how to do the annotation, you can also just put it in chat if you'd like. So Amy's putting some directions on there about how to do that. Click on the three dots from the top and select annotate. But like she said, you can also put it in chat. So I can see a few people putting some stars on there. So I'll give everybody about 20 seconds maybe to say why did you choose to join the session today? All right, we already have a variety. We have a new one, some new people, some people that are responsible for training others, some people looking for resources. I like the variety of annotations we have going on. We got some stars, got some hearts, got some checks, got some arrows, got some drawings. So I like that. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, there you go. Riley, do you know how to clear all that off? Hopefully. Thank you for saying why we're coming to the session. So as we're getting that cleared off, the point of this session or the outcomes we want from this session is number one there, identify the essential components of the IEP as outlined in the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So we're going to go through each of the required components of the IEP. Explain how the IEP provides the foundation for promoting progress of students with disabilities. So, and you'll see through our presentation, the IEP is not the end goal. The IEP is the tool you developed to help that student progress in their services and their goals, and also in their general education setting. So, understand how the parts of the IEP fit together to develop a high quality educational programming, and apply tips and resources for developing and implementing IEPs that promote progress. So that's what we're going to learn about today. All right, so we're going to start out with this the role of the IEP on the path to progress. This is kind of going to give an overview and set us up for the rest of our day today. All right, so you see, I like this graphic here. I'm actually, one of my former lives, I was a secondary math teacher, so I taught middle school and high school math. So this graphic kind of speaks to me in how we explain it as well. So you see, first of all, we have that in the red box there, a high quality instructional programming. So when we talk today, I mean, we're going to talk a lot about the IEP, but just know, again, the IEP is not the end all be all. The IEP is a part of the educational programming that a student receives, including their special education services, but also including their general education services, because they're going to get supports in their general education settings as well. So when we talk about high quality instructional programming, we're not just talking about the IEP, we're talking about everything that student is going to be involved in their school environment. So the reason we have this set up as a multiplication problem there is because if you think about math, if you think about multiplying numbers together, if you're multiplying if one of the numbers you're multiplying is a 0, then that means your answer is going to be 0, right? So that means if you say you've developed a really great high quality instructional programming. You've got everything in place. You've got all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, and it's a really good plan and program you have set up. But if you don't have very good implementation as well, then your improved access and outcomes for those students is not going to be good. Same thing. If you don't have good development, if you haven't set up a good plan, if you haven't set up a good program for that student, but your implementation is really good, you have really good teachers using really good resources and strategies, you're still not set up for the individualization for that student. So you're still not going to get the outcomes that you want. So you have to have both of those really to get those improved outcomes and access that you want for those students, that free, appropriate public education. All right. So if you were here this morning, you saw this slide when Tessie, our director, was presenting about considerations for high quality instructional programming. So on the left there, like I said, we're not only just talking about special education, but how is your core programming developed and delivered to promote progress and belonging for students with disabilities? So that's the first thing, because all students are general education students first. And I think there's a statistic out there that it's like 80% of students in special education spend 80% of their time in the general education setting. So the majority of students with a disability spend the majority of their time in a a general education setting. So that's a big part of their educational programming. The right side there says, how well is your IEPs designed and delivered to promote progress for each student with a disability? So that's the main thing we're going to touch on today, is making sure that is, you understand all the parts, you understand how it's designed, and how that's going to work together to have a high quality instructional programming for those students with a disability. All right, next slide. There you go. Here's our stair steps. These are our necessary ingredients for designing and delivering high quality instructional programming. And we're going to return to these throughout our day as we talk through each of these steps. So I'll just quickly hit on each one. So that first one, believe in our collective ability to positively impact students and maintain high expectations for all students. So that's what we call collective efficacy. Do the staff believe that they can actually impact and have a good impact on students' achievement? That second part there, ensure that all students feel like they belong in our school community. So again, just like you heard, if you were there for our opening session, you heard from Powell Middle School how much it included belonging in what they do, and how much that has an impact on their students. Know the students and their circumstances, like know what is going on with that student. What do they need? That's where we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the PLAF statement there. Articulate what we want students to do. Like, what are the goals? What do we need students to achieve in order to make progress in that general education setting? And the last one there, know what knowledge, skills, and strategies students need to meet ambitious goals and show success in the general education classroom. So what services, what supports do those students need in order to make the progress that they need to make? So these are our stair steps that we'll come back to throughout our day today. All right. So in IDEA, there's 3 parts to the free appropriate public education requirements, the FAPE requirements. So there's a procedural, substantive, and implementation. So the first one there, procedural. So when we talk about the procedural ones, we're talking about the Rowley Supreme Court decision. Basically, what that's saying is, do you have all the parts of the IEP that are necessary? Do you have all the parts that you have to have to be a compliant IEP? Not only all the parts, but are you doing things within the timelines that are required and things like that? So, do you have everything to make sure you have a compliant IEP and the procedures set forth in IDEA? The substantive part is what the Andrew F. decision, which we're going to talk a lot about today, that kind of clarified for us. So what they said there is not only is it necessary to have the compliant parts of the IEP, but you also have to make sure that IEP is reasonably calculated for that student to make progress. So that student's individual needs, are they accounted for? And is that IEP set up for that student to make progress in light of their circumstances? And then again, just like our graphic from before, those two are kind of talking about the development of the IEP. This last part is talking about the implementation of the IEP. So once those services and supports are set up in the IEP, are you implementing it the way you're supposed to? Are you setting up those things, or is your services set up so that student is going to make progress? Are you doing everything you're supposed to be doing that's set up in the IEP? So that's what that implementation part is talking about. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a video that we're going to watch where it's a bike analogy we like to use at the Progress Center, where you're going to see how are we comparing the bike and the parts of the bike and the IEP and the parts of the IEP and how they have to work together to make sure that they're promoting progress for students. All right, you can start this video.
School and post-school success for students with disabilities depends on the development and implementation of a high-quality individualized education program, or an IEP. The IEP's development and implementation are comparable to the design and use of a bicycle. Bicycles are made up of individual parts, but it is only useful as a bike when all the parts seamlessly fit together. Similarly, an IEP is composed of required parts that, when aligned to each other, create an individualized program or vehicle that allows students with disabilities to make progress. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, outlines 7 required components or parts of a procedurally compliant IEP. Similar to a bike, which requires a frame, wheels, handlebars, seat, pedals, brakes, and chain, an IEP must include a present level of academic achievement and functional performance, PLAF, statement, measurable annual goals, a monitoring plan, statement of special education and services and aids, an explanation of the student's participation outside regular education and in state and district-wide assessments, and the date, frequency, duration, and location of services. Unfortunately, many educators and service providers focus on the development of individual components or parts of the IEP found in their IEP form or template. This can lead to what many believe is a compliant IEP that cannot be feasibly implemented or is not likely to promote progress. Focusing on the IEP components in isolation can devalue the IEP as a valuable tool and place compliance as the end result. It would be like buying expensive bike parts that do not fit together. What makes the bicycle functional is when all its parts fit together or align so that it can be ridden. It's the collection of the aligned parts that provides us with a well-designed bicycle. Ensuring all the parts of a bike fit together is very similar to ensuring the required parts of an IEP fit together. In well-developed IEPs, there is a direct relationship between the PLAF statement and the other components of the IEP. Ensuring the parts of the IEP fit together to demonstrate internal consistency allows IEP teams to address both the procedural and substantive requirements of providing students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education. Well-designed IEPs are also easier to implement and more likely to lead to improved academic and functional outcomes. The PLAF statement is the foundation of the IEP that documents the student's needs and baseline for measurable annual goals that are necessary to support the student in accessing and progressing in the general curriculum. A well-designed PLAF statement also justifies the proposed services and aids, including specially designed instruction and classroom accommodations and supports that are reasonably calculated to help the student progress on annual IEP goals and on state and district-wide assessments. Although bikes have similar components, not all bicycles are the same. Some are designed for the Tour de France, while others for going on a picnic or to the beach. There is no wrong bicycle, assuming the parts work together to meet the unique needs of that user. IEPs are very similar. They all have the same required components, but are designed to meet the unique needs of the student. How do we know if the IEP meets the student's needs? For each annual goal, the IEP team develops a description of how the student's progress towards the goal will be measured, which is shared with parents and families. When implemented with fidelity, the monitoring plan provides data that the IEP team can use to determine whether the IEP is reasonably calculated to promote appropriate progress for the student. In some cases, the student's circumstances and needs change, and the IEP team, which includes the family and student, when appropriate, may need to make changes to the proposed aids and services. Remember, the IEP is not the outcome. It is the vehicle through which we can support students with disabilities in achieving school and post-school goals. Just like a well-maintained bicycle helps us navigate various terrains, an IEP that is implemented with fidelity and uses ongoing data to monitor its impact can help a student overcome obstacles and make meaningful progress. A well-developed and implemented IEP can ensure students with disabilities are able to access and benefit from school and post-school opportunities alongside their peers.
All right. So that's something we'll refer back to is and not just the bike analogy, but making sure all those parts of the IEP work together. That was a good does a good explanation of showing how you start with the PLAF statement and how it affects all the other areas. And we're going to kind of emphasize that today. So the point across that we're trying to get across in that video is bikes the same as IEPs. Bikes all have similar parts. There's a bike for a 6-year-old is going to be different than a racing bike is going to be different than a beach bike. So it's like they all have similar parts, but they just when they come together, it's for a specific function. The same as an IEP. IEPs all have to have those same parts, all those procedural parts that we were talking about earlier that come together. But when they come together, they're supposed to be specifically for that kiddo. So it's making sure that they're addressing all their needs to get all the services and accommodations and things like that they need specifically that fit into those procedural parts. That's the substantive part is making sure all those parts fit together for that student. And then just like we mentioned before, so what is a great IEP if it doesn't guide implementation? So again, it's not good enough just to have a really great IEP. It's not good enough to make sure you have all the parts there and all those parts work together. You need to make sure that you have that a good level of implementation. And we're going to talk more about what we mean by fidelity of implementation and the capacity to implement on the next slide. So the fidelity of implementation means, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? Like, are you giving that student all the services, all the supports that are outlined in that IEP document? The capacity to implement means, do you have the staff? Does the staff have the proper training and knowledge to implement that IEP? So not only is it about, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing, but does the staff have the right training and supports to be able to implement that IEP? Okay. So on the next slide, what we're going to come back to and what we talked about today, or I'm sorry, earlier today in our opening session was that success, that building a successful system for that IEP to be implemented in. So if you saw earlier, you heard Tessie talk about things like educator support, staff collaboration, student belonging. All these things go together, if you saw that star graphic, to help build a successful system. So again, the IEP is not the end all be all. It's not the end of the conversation. It's the vehicle that we ride along this road of a successful system to get implemented to help that student make success. And it's these parts that help us have that good system to implement that IEP. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Amy, where she's going to go over the basics of the IEP. Go ahead, Amy.
Great, thanks, Stephen. I think we just heard kind of why the IEP is important and why we can think about kind of the IEP as the vehicle for support for students with disabilities as part of their overarching curriculum and programming alongside their core curriculum and access to the general instruction. We're going to really focus in on this next section on kind of what are the key parts of the IEP for those who are newer to this process. And for those who are supporting others and thinking about the IEP development, what are some of the ways that you can talk about this for those that you're working with? So we're going to start off this section with a quick little quiz here to say, per the IDEA, now that's an important thing, per the IDEA, how many requirements do all IEPs need to have? And then again, I'm going to emphasize there the all in this sentence. So think about this and go ahead and think about that for a second. And then put in the chat kind of number 1, 2, 3, or 4. What do you think is the correct answer there? Is it 5 parts, 7 parts, 9 parts, or 11 parts that all IEPs need to have according to IDEA? Yeah, I see some answers coming in. Keep them coming. All right, well, you guys are relying here on just a couple of responses, but the answer there is really 2 or 7 required parts. And this is a little challenging here, right? Because one of the things that we're talking about is the IDEA, and each state may have additional requirements that they add to IEP components. But when we think about what are the essential elements of an IEP as noted in IDEA, we go to 7 required components. Now, some of you might also be thinking about things like transition plans or other special considerations or things like that that may be part of all of the IEPs that you're working on. Or for a select group of students, you may add a transition plan for students that are meet the requirements for needing a transition plan. But that's not the case for all IEPs. So when we think about those 7 essential components of the IEP, we're thinking about things like the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statement, or the PLAF statement, the measurable annual goals, the monitoring plan, or the monitoring toward progress toward the annual goals, the statement of special education and aids and services, that's your specially designed instruction and your related services and your supplementary aids and services and program modifications. In that one component of that IEP, there's a lot of meat there. We've also got the explanation of the educational setting, as well as participation in the assessment, or whether or not a student will participate in state and district assessments, and the date and frequency and location of those services. So we're going to take a second to allow you to unpack kind of what are those required components of the IEP before we jump forward into some of the how those pieces connect together and really look at them in more depth. So in the chat, we're going to add a link to the IEP overview document tip sheet that you can see here on the slide to allow you to have a little bit of time to dig into this overview and of those key components of the IEP. We're going to do this activity called Analyzing the IEP Tip Sheet. And for those of you that are newer to the IEP, we're going to run through this for you so you can experience it. For those of you that might be training other folks in this, go ahead and experience this activity and think about how you might be able to leverage it for work with the folks that you're training and so on. So we're going to give you a second, just about 3 minutes or so, to look at the document that I just put in the chat. And we can add that back into the chat a couple more times so you can make sure you have access to it. You're going to go ahead, review it, read through. If you want to highlight on your PDF, feel free to do that. Make any notes. If you have a jot of paper, you can add that there as well. Then we're going to bring you together in some small breakout conversations for you to reflect and react as you think about kind of what are standing out to you on that document, what might have been different than what you thought before, what might be ways that you think about talking about this in a different way. And then we'll bring it back together as a whole group to have a little bit of a conversation there. So I'm going to drop that link in the chat for you again, in case you just are coming in. I see there's some folks that are still joining at this point.
Hear me, my name is Trina.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Great.
So our team, a lot of us, are experienced either as parents or as special educators. So we're very used to the IEP process. But I think the consensus within our group was just the fact that having all of this information just very clearly outlined for a novice and or someone, a teacher, a general educator. I'm fortunate enough that I work in an all special education school, but that's not always the case. I used to be at general ed schools, and I just I would use the term like, the general educators that maybe have an inclusion student or have to come to IEP meetings. They're terrified. They just don't know what to expect, and they're not sure. And one of my teammates, Colette, explained like, it's very dense material that we're dealing with. These are, legally binding documents, and a lot of this stuff is very dry reading. But I just feel like what you provided with us to us with this one pager was really concise, and I'm looking forward to be able to share it with people that are new to the process.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think I saw some chats coming in too of thinking about kind of getting back to the simplicity, or getting back to some of the key pieces kind of what IDEA actually says, or including the language and the regulations. One of the things that you might have seen in the right column where it says, where can I learn more, is that there's tip sheets for each of the components of the IEP that are also linked. And on each of those pages, there's also this kind of overview of what does the IDEA actually say for each of those components. What does it say about the present level statement? What does it say about measurable annual goals? Because a lot of times I think, we are in this work all the time. And when we're talking maybe to a parent who is not as familiar, or a general education teacher who hasn't had that experience, or someone who's newer to this work, really being able to take a step back and think about, what does the law actually say? And what does that look like and feel like for us in our work? So those are some of the things that we might want to think about as we look at this. The other thing that I will just mention is that there are versions of this tip sheet. There are the overview tip sheet, as well as one for the IEP team, which we'll see in just a second, available, that are really focused for parents. It's very similar content, but the language, is a little bit transferred to thinking about your student or your child and so on, instead of students. And actually, this overview tip sheet really started from the parent perspective, and then we transferred it over to thinking about kind of what does that look like for educators as well. And then also there are versions of all of these available in Spanish as well. So those are also available for you on the Progress Center website there. Anyone else want to share any reflections or takeaways? I see a lot of good things in the chat, thinking about how to share them with others, thinking about the simplicity of the language and so on. Oh, I see a question in here, or wondering about a template for specifics for the PLAF section or the PLAF statement. And we'll get into some conversation about the PLAF statement in just a little bit. Riley's going to dive much deeper into that one. But really, if we flip over to the next slide, the thing that we'll say is really there is no, if you click one time, Riley, I think there's animations on this one. There's no kind of IEP definition or outline of while it says the required components in IDEA, there's no IEP document, what it must look like, that is consistent across the board. The IDEA does not outline one IEP document that must look consistently across all states and all localities. Some states might have state level IEP documents that you guys are familiar with. Others, you may have multiple different IEPs that you use in different times in your lives, depending on what district you're a part of or what state you've been a part of, and things might look a little bit different. So you'll recognize that there is no one IEP document that everyone must use. There are, across different states, some consistencies across those IEP documents, but the IDEA does not say, this is what the document must look like. It does say these are the required components of what the document might have. So as I mentioned before, the second bullet here just really emphasizes this, that the states must meet the minimum requirements set forth in IDEA. So you can't have less than the required components. You can't have not have the PLAF statement, not have measurable annual goals, but you can go above and beyond in establishing additional requirements for the development and the implementation of the IEP, and really defining what those look like for your districts and LEAs and so on. So you're depending on your different state, you may experience this a little bit differently. One of the tools and resources that we developed through the Progress Center based on our work with our partnership sites was to get around this kind of challenge, is people not always understanding kind of where in their IEP document that they are working on. What does the present level statement look like in our document? Sometimes in some documents, there might be multiple sections where the present level is split across different areas, or you might have challenges finding kind of the statement of services and aids or the key components there. So the getting to know your IEP document or tool here is a training tool. It includes a facilitator's guide as well as an activity for participants to help walk through kind of what that might look like in your IEP document. How do you find where the PLAF statement lives in your IEP document? What does that look like in comparison to what IDEA says about the required components of the PLAF statement and so on? And so this might be a nice tool for those of you that are in the roles of training and supporting folks or working with folks that are newer to looking at an IEP to really think about kind of where is the measurable annual goals in our document? How are they laid out? What does that look like for us? So just a tool or a resource there for you to consider using. The other thing that you saw emphasized in that bike example is the connections between all of the different components of the IEP. As we really think about that substantive piece of FAPE, we really want to think about how are these pieces of the IEP really working together to understand the student's unique circumstances and ensure we're making progress to those goals for the student. And so you can see here as Riley animates all of the different arrows that come with this slide, that how the PLAF statement leads to the statement of services and aids and our decision about participation outside of the regular education classroom, as well as the state and district-wide assessments, really thinking about kind of how the PLAF statement drives our annual goals and how our annual goals connect then to the statement of special education and services and aids, and how those also connect back to the annual goals. How do we ensure that we're measuring that content in order to really understand whether students are making progress as they move forward? And so really thinking about kind of how, when we look at our IEPs and we look at the development of these different components that are laid out in that tip sheet that you looked at, how are we ensuring that we're making the connections across each of those parts so that there is internal consistencies from the needs identified in the PLAF statement all the way to the services and aids that we're outlining in the statement of special education and services and aids and so on? Are all of those services supported by a need and driven by a need? Or did we just document all of the available accommodations that could potentially support a student and not really think about what does that look like for the specific needs of this student? Did we really make a connection between the student's needs as outlined in the PLAF statement and the goals that we are going to develop and so on? And so as we talk through the session today, we'll really look at some of these connections and really talk about how those parts fit together. And Riley will talk about how the PLAF statement is really the foundation of this work. The other thing you saw on the back of the tip sheet was really outlining some of the key components about IEP development and helping people to understand kind of how IEPs are developed and that it's a team-based decision. And it's really that collective work of all of us coming together in order to develop a program for the student based on their needs, really thinking collaboratively from the perspectives of the general education teacher, from the special education teacher, from maybe related service providers, from the parent and families, maybe from the student themselves about kind of what are the needs and what are the supports and services that they need. So really thinking about kind of the initial development and then making sure that we're really thinking through the reviewing and updating of the IEP over time. So as we think about kind of the IEP development, it's really driven by that IEP team. And I mentioned before this IEP tip sheet for parents. There's a version here for the IEP team. There's also one available for educators around the IEP team as well, helping people to understand who should be part of the IEP. The IDEA outlines those key required people to be part of the IEP, making sure that parents of the child is part of that IEP team, making sure that not less than one regular education teacher of the child, not less than one special education teacher, a representative of the public agency, an individual who can interpret instructional implications for evaluation results, and so on. Other individuals who have knowledge and special expertise regarding the student, and when appropriate, the student with the as well. They can be a great self-advocate for themselves, really thinking through kind of their role on the IEP team. So as we walk through kind of these different pieces, is really thinking about the collaborative nature of this work as well. And one of the things that I'll just point out here as we think about the IEP team members, that oftentimes one IEP team member may serve multiple roles, right? For example, the special ed teacher may have specific knowledge regarding the child and also expertise in interpreting the evaluation results. So as we think about the folks on the IEP team, that's something for us to think about as well as we move forward. One of the things that was the main focus of our event last year was this idea of collective efficacy, and that we can do better and develop better IEPs and develop better services and supports for students if we work collectively together. That idea that we really are multiple heads are better than one, thinking about the fact that no single teacher has all the time or all the knowledge and all the skills to meet all the needs of every child in his or her class, right? No special education teacher can support the student just by themselves. They really need the collective work of a team to really support the student. So that might include the related service provider, the family, additional staff members, a coach, a bus driver, paraprofessionals, medical professionals, depending on the student's needs, the principal, the general education teacher, and others. Really thinking about this idea that really this collaboration, this looking across the supports from everyone is really how we design a program that best supports the student, as well as support the implementation of that program as we roll it out and make sure that we are thinking about our capacity to implement and so on. So as Stephen was saying earlier, so really thinking through this idea, right, that it's really all of us working together in order to support the student. That's the goal of that IEP team. So I'm going to pause here for a second just to see if folks have some questions, if there's anything they want to ask about before we move on.
So as Amy mentioned, we're now going to dive a little bit deeper into those required components of the IEPs, starting with the present level statement and knowing the student's circumstances. So taking this back to this graphic that we've seen a couple times now, highlighting the necessary ingredients for designing and delivering high quality instructional programming. We touched on that first step, the idea of collective efficacy, that more heads are better than one when it comes to supporting students with disabilities and developing those IEPs. If you were in the opening keynote earlier, you heard Dr. Tessie Bailey talk a little bit about students feeling like they belong in our school community. And in this section, we're going to hop on over to knowing students and their circumstances and why that is important for developing high quality PLAF statements. Again, bringing us back to this graphic, and as we saw in the video earlier in this session, that it really is important to understand your students and their needs in order for you to develop an IEP that addresses their individual needs. Again, the information in the present level statement or the PLAF statement is a starting point from which IEP teams can specify appropriate goals, services, supports, and progress monitoring plans. The PLAF statement has to be comprehensive and detailed enough so that the team can set appropriately ambitious goals in light of those child's individual circumstances. As you see on the bottom, a quote from the U.S. Department of Education, just re-highlighting that there should be a direct relationship between the present levels of performance and other components of the IEP. Now, as you may have heard us mention, the Andrew F. decision really is the backbone of the Progress Center's work. And this is because under IDEA, the IEP serves as the foundation of promoting progress for students with disabilities. And we know that a well-designed IEP ensures that students have access to special education and related services, supplementary aids and services, and benefit from high-quality core programming. As you can see in the emphasized text on the next couple of slides, the Andrew F. Supreme Court decision states that an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Again, bringing the emphasis back on the individualization of the child that you are writing the IEP for. Before we dive a little bit deeper, we're going to go ahead and do one more breakout activity that we like to call Knowing Your Student. So on the screen, you'll see some instructions that we'll go through here. We're going to break you out into rooms of 2 or 3. You're going to share a short introduction with your group, and then number off 1, 2, and 3, or just 1 and 2. If you are a person 1, we want you to identify a student with a disability who you know well, that you might work with quite often in your school or in your educational setting. In 3 minutes or less, you are going to describe that student's disability, how it affects the student's education, and what you think needs to happen for the student to be successful in school. Person 2 and 3, or just person 2, we're going to listen while person 1 shares out and make some notes about the impact of the disability, as well as the primary and secondary needs that you are hearing. When person 1 finishes sharing out, you're going to take about 2 minutes to ask questions for clarification about this student or how their disability impacts them in their educational setting. Together, you're going to take 2 minutes to confirm your description of the student, their needs, and what supports you believe would be best. And then we'll come back out here and think a little bit about this as a group. All righty, welcome back, everyone. I think everyone has now made their way back into the main space. As you see on the screen, we have some reflection questions for that activity that we're going to give you just a couple of seconds to think about before we invite anyone to share out from their conversations with the group. First question, what are some key takeaways from this activity? Second question to think about was how easy or difficult was it for you to describe the student, if you were person 1 or from person 2/3's perspective?
Did explain in our ARD last year.
And then our last question is, how does this activity facilitate meaningful engagement of families and other educators in the planning and the development of the IEP? We invite you to come off mute and share out some reflections on any of these questions or just the activity in general. You may also drop your answers in the chat.
Hello, this is Deirdre Baker from
Hi,
Southern
Deirdre.
Maryland. And from this discussion, it just shows how significant it is to have multiple voices in the room for the student. You could be the one who's working with the student, and you can be the one describing the student's disability and what they've experienced, and you have suggestions, but hearing someone else's take on what you've shared helps to trigger more thoughts for you as well.
Absolutely. That is a fantastic reflection and something we're going to touch on a little bit more in the next couple of slides, as well as something that we heard earlier in the session. So I absolutely and fantastic reflection. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Anyone have any similar experiences as Deirdre, or different experiences or different learnings or wonderings from completing this activity?
Ori mentioned in the chat that it was just helpful to be able to talk through and think through that and get, expand the mindset by being able to talk through kind of those different strategies or the needs for the student too.
Absolutely. Thanks for highlighting that, Amy. Then just to share out some other, learnings that we have had at the Progress Center from doing this activity with multiple different sites, that this really helps you shift the focus from the IEP, that compliance piece, the document that, you're just filling out, to the student's needs as the team develops the IEP. And it really helps you think and focus on the student versus the completion of the document when you write the PLAF statement. And we invite you to consider how this type of activity could be used in an IEP meeting. It can be difficult sometimes to walk into an IEP meeting and have a good understanding of that student at the meeting. And sometimes we need to do some work ahead of time to really make sure we know the student, know the needs, know what supports would be best for them. So this is a really easy activity to do with those familiar with the student prior to the IEP meeting or just on your own to get yourself thinking about the needs of that student before walking into that IEP meeting to develop a document that is individualized for that student. And I invite you to keep, adding some thoughts and reflections in the chat if anything else comes up as we continue on.
One thing I'll just jump in, Riley, real quick
Yeah,
is
please.
I dropped in the chat the facilitator guide for this activity, but I would say also one of the things that we found with this activity is it's even better and more powerful face-to-face, which I'm sure you all have could imagine and experience, kind of thinking about kind of how you would run it or think about this in a face-to-face environment versus a breakout room. Just being able to kind of work on the timing and help move people through the activity and so on. So just wanted to share that briefly, that yes, we can do things virtually, but sometimes that opportunity to really talk together and have those conversations and build off each other happens even better when we have that opportunity face to face. And many of you get that opportunity a little bit more than we do for this work. So just wanted to plug that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. All right, moving on. So as you heard in the video that we shared earlier, the PLAF statement provides the foundation on which the rest of the IEP is built. So another analogy, just thinking like building a house, it is important that we have a high quality PLAF statement foundation to build the rest of the IEP. And in a 2006 court case decision, in the case of Kirby versus Cable County Board of Education, really underscored this idea of the importance of the present level statements by saying that the child level of academic achievement and functional performance is the foundation on which the IEP must be built. Without a clear identification of present levels, the IEP cannot set measurable goals, evaluate the child's progress, and determine which educational and related services are needed. Again, just underscoring the idea that it is critical to know our students to appropriately identify the student's present level statement. So as you think about designing your PLAF statement, what are some key questions that you might want to consider? First, what do we want for our students, which is described in the present level statement and in our measurable annual goals? Second, what is the student's current reality and unique circumstances as described in the PLAF statement? Third, what does the student need to be successful as described in the PLAF statement and outlined in the aids and services? And lastly, how can we maximize our resources to support the student, described in the placement and implementation of the IEP? And these questions are all important, but these first three are really essential for knowing the student and to collaboratively, as a team, develop the PLAF statement with the family, student, related service providers, educators, and other individuals who might know that student and can contribute to the development of their IEP. So let's take a minute to review what IDEA says about the PLAF statement. As you can see up here on the right, we do have a screenshot of the present level statement tip sheet that can be accessed on the Progress Center website. So first, you'll see that it says that the present level is a statement of child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So it's important that we highlight the "and" here between academic achievement and functional performance. In fact, to ensure that the written statement in the IEP addresses all areas of need, academic and functional. Information about the student's academic achievement and functional performance is essential because IEP teams must ensure that students with disabilities have supports that address all areas of need, regardless of whether a student may have an annual goal in both areas. Moving forward, IDEA also reads that how the child's disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum, i.e. the same curriculum for their non-disabled peers, or for preschool children, as appropriate, how the disability affects the child's participation in appropriate activities. By this, we mean the same curriculum as their non-disabled peers, again, because all students are general education students first. Lastly, just circling back to the idea that this is a statement, as it all should be one statement. In a state or district's IEP template, the information that is included in the PLAF statement may be in separate parts of the IEP, but it is all part of the one statement. So breaking this down a little bit further, what is meant by present levels of academic achievement? And as we just saw, a PLAF statement must include a summary of performance for both academic and functional performance. So IDEA regulations do not define academic achievements, but the US Department of Education, in response to some questions, provided additional clarification for this domain. The US Department of Education explained academic achievement generally refers to a child's performance in academic areas. It could vary depending on the child's circumstances or situation, and therefore there is no generalized or widely accepted definition of academic achievement and is not included in IDEA regulations. Some examples of areas covered by academic achievement may include math, science, history, writing, or reading. And now moving on, what is meant by present levels of functional performance? So functional performance generally refers to activities that are not considered academic or related to a child's academic achievement. Functional often is used in the context of routine activities of everyday living. And the range of functional skills is as varied as the individual needs of children with disabilities. So before we move forward, I just want to give you a couple seconds to think of examples of functional skills that you typically see in your IEPs. We're going to highlight some on the next slide, but just think to yourself first, when you think of functional performance, what are some functional skills that you typically see in IEPs of students that you work with? So through our work with the Progress Center, we've found that most educators commonly think of these that we see listed across the top of the screen here. We have dressing and eating and toileting and mobility. But how about these? Do you think about these as functional skills? We have social skills and communication, executive function, and behavior. The bottom four boxes could all impact students regardless of the disability category. And sometimes it can be a struggle for IEP teams to identify the functional skills needed because educators may not know the skills needed to learn. So it's important to consider the whole student and their needs. So we're going to break down the four components of a high-quality PLAF statement. And although IDEA regulations do not specify the structure of the PLAF statement, the IEP team can begin to process the development of a high-quality PLAF statement by focusing on four essential elements. These four components can also be described in the tip sheet that we shared previously. The first one, student needs, so information on the student's current academic and/or functional needs. Effect on progress in the general education, or an explanation of how the disability affects the student's access to, involvement, and progress in the general education curriculum. We have baseline information or some data for monitoring student progress. And again, this data needs to be reviewed to determine whether the student is making progress and should relate directly to the identified areas of need. And then the connection to goals and/or services, which is the bridge between the PLAF statement and measurable annual goals. So to ask yourself, is there enough information in the PLAF statement to develop ambitious measurable annual goals? One thing that we have to make sure we do when we are writing our PLAF statement is avoiding assumptions. So what are the dangers of assumptions? When we assume, we make decisions about programming or identify practices, supports, or strategies based on our assumptions or beliefs rather than on evidence. This is why the PLAF statement is important. It prevents us from making assumptions about the student, and also why it's critical to know your student before designing their IEP. Further, here are some additional considerations when you're developing the PLAF statement. So the PLAF statement is based on the individual needs of a child because of their disability, but it is not based on the disability category itself. The individualized education must be developed based on the student's unique needs, as according to the Supreme Court, that is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. The US Department of Education also says that a district cannot lawfully prepare IEPs with the same statement of current levels of performance for all students within a specific program. and that it is impermissible for districts to have the IEP for each student in a class or disability category contain identical statements of present levels of educational performance. So we touched on this idea again, just bringing it back, the power of teams to develop a high quality PLAF statement. With the voices of many people who know the student, that is how you're going to get the best and most high quality PLAF statement based on the individual needs of that student. And it really is a statement, a collective statement that should include multiple perspectives from the student, parents, general educators, related service providers, special educators, and others who know and work with the student. And a tip for progress that we have learned from our years working as the center is to collect and summarize data for the development of the PLAF statement prior to the IEP meeting to help facilitate a more robust discussion with the team members. And again, the Progress Center has developed some resources for parents and students that can be used to gather their input prior to developing the IEP and help them prepare IEP meetings. And with that, I am going to pass it back over to Stephen, and he is going to continue on talking about measurable annual goals.
All right. Thanks, Riley. And if you attended our opening session this morning with our director, Dr. Tessie Bailey, she touched on this a little bit. And so we're going to you're going to hear some of the same information that she talked about today as far as indicators of progress for students with disabilities. So on the next slide, you'll see this is that stair step we're coming back to throughout our presentation. So we're going to talk about articulating what we want our students to do. And that's what we're going to do that through the IEP goals that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Okay. All right, so this is that same graphic that you probably saw this morning if you saw Tessie speak. That kind of outlines all the areas of progress that we look for that we look at for students with disabilities. The main one we're concentrating on today is the IEP goal progress. So those goals that are set up for those kiddos not only help them to learn skills that they need, but it also helps them to learn those skills to progress more in their grade level classes and their general education curriculum. So that's why you kind of start with the IEP, but the IEP should also help them achieve more in the grade level curriculum and that grade level progress. Then as students are making more and more progress at their grade level, that's where you're going to hopefully see the results in those state and national accountability measures that all students have to take, and then districts are held accountable for these things. So all students with disabilities should be a part of that testing. There's a small amount of students that may take like an alternate assessment, but all students are still accountable for that testing, the same as their non-disabled peers. So learning more on their IEPs help them to achieve more at their grade level, helps them to come back or helps them to make that progress on those state and national measures. And all three of those are leading to that post-school success. That's kind of the ultimate goal of what we do with them in school. We want to get them ready for whatever that post-school success is, whether it's going into higher education, maybe it's living on their own, maybe it's getting a job, whatever that post-school success is that we set up and determine and with their families and the students, that's what we're working towards. But it kind of starts with our students with disabilities. It kind of starts with that IEP and those goals on the IEP. So let's talk some more about that. Okay, so here's that graphic that we saw in our video earlier. And again, we're kind of returning to this as well throughout our presentation. So you see there the annual goals highlighted. So if you have your PLAF statement, that's your foundation. That's what Riley just got finished talking about. So in that PLAF statement, you're going to list all the needs that student has, all the needs that student has based on their disability. Some of those needs will need goals. So not every need in the PLAF will need a goal. But those primary needs, those ones that will probably need specially designed instruction, those will have goals. And so that's how the PLAF statement is connected to those annual goals. And then you see how the annual goals is connected to the statement of special education and aids and services and those other areas there, because those are the things that are going to be set up to help that student not only make progress on their goals, but to make progress in the general education classroom. So that's why you see that it kind of circle back around to the goals, because those services and aids and things that are set up for the student should connect to those goals and help that student make progress on those goals. So that's how everything is kind of fitting, connecting when you're talking about the PLAF statement, the needs, the goals, what do we want the student to achieve, and then the services, how are we going to help the student achieve those goals? Okay, and just reminding us about the Andrew F. decision is that the IEP, we have to make sure that it's reasonably calculated to make sure that child can make progress appropriate in light of that child's circumstances. So specifically for that student and not just filling out those parts of the IEP plan, like we were talking about with the procedural part. We don't want to just fill it out like it's a form. We want to make sure all those parts fit and make sense for what that student needs. Okay, so here's some more things about why measurable annual goals are important. So number one there, they address individual academic and functional needs outlined in the PLAF statement. So that's kind of what I mentioned before. Your PLAF statement has all the needs of that student. Some of those primary needs are going to have those goals attached to them. So that's what that first bullet's talking about. Number two there, ensure high expectations and grade level alignment in light of the child's circumstances. So not every student that's receiving special education services will have a grade level goal. But what you want to do is whatever their grade level peers are working on, you want to make sure that that student has a goal and it has services that address maybe some lower level skills that they need that align to that grade level material. So you're trying to close that gap between where they are and where we need them to be as far as the grade level alignment. Number three there, assess whether the special education program is enabling the student to make progress in light of the student's circumstances. So that's how it circles back around to the goals is we want to make sure whatever services and things we have set up for that student are actually helping that student to make progress on their goals. And so I attended a session one time and I heard somebody say something that I really liked. And so I steal it every time I do this presentation. So I want to give teachers permission to not have 100% of their IEPs set up for all of their students 100% perfect every single time. You know, you're not you're going to set up the IEP the best you can with what you know about that student, about the things you maybe the teachers he had last year, the things you know about the student this year, all his data from progress monitoring and state assessments and things like that. You're going to set up the best plan that you know at that time. But as we know, things are going to change for that student. Some things are going to work as well or not work as well or work better than what we thought they were going to. So it's okay not to have the 100% perfect plan set up for that student in the beginning. But what's not okay is as you're progress monitoring and you see that student's not making the progress that they need to make to try to meet that goal, then what's not okay is to not do something about it. So once you see that that student's not making the progress that they need to try to achieve that annual goal, then you need to bring your team together, talk about, okay, what's going on with the student? What can we do differently? What else does the student need to help get them back on track? So it's okay not to have the perfect plan set up. It's not okay to do something about it once you know that perfect plan's not set up. All right, so how do the goals connect to the other components of the IEP? All right, so you have in your PLAF statement, that's where the student is now, right? That's kind of like what their baseline is for that year when you're going to set up your new goal. And when you set up your annual goals, you're going to say like, this is where we want the student to be 1 year from now. This is where we think, based on what we know, where they are now, what we know about the student, the supports we know that are going to be set up. Here's where we think the student should be, trying to move them closer to that grade level achievement. Okay, so between that PLAF, between the beginning of the year, or the beginning of the IEP time, with that baseline and where that annual goal is, all those arrows in between there, those are all the services and things that are going on at the same time. So all those services, the supports you set up for that student are helping that student move from that baseline to that annual goal, all the things going on around it. So during that year, what those vertical lines represent there is those are the times in the year that you should be checking your data, looking to see, is the student making the progress they should be making at this time to be on track to meet that goal. Because again, if they're not on track, then it's not okay not to do something. You don't want to just the student to be not on track for a full year. And then by the end of that year, you're just like, oh, they didn't meet their goal. We kind of thought they weren't going to because we knew they weren't on track, 6 months ago. So when you see that they're not on track, then that's when you can make those changes that you need to, either instructionally or giving more support or whatever it needs to help that student be on track to meet that annual goal. All right, so if you see over here, this is our tip sheet on the measurable annual goals. Again, this can be found on our Progress Center website. But here's what the IDEA says about goals. So again, it's a statement about measurable annual goals. So all those annual goals kind of fit together in one big statement that include the academic and functional goals designed to part A there says meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So again, it's not just it's not just goals set up for that student. It's goals to help fill in those skills that they need to make progress in the general education curriculum. And then part B says there, meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from the child's disability. So the child may have other needs that also come about because of that disability. So you may need to have goals around those as well. And then part 2 there, I kind of mentioned before. So those children, for children that have disabilities who take an alternate assessment, those students have to have a description of benchmarks or short-term objectives about their goals. Now, some states make teachers write benchmarks or short-term objectives for all their goals, no matter what. But some states don't. I live in Texas, and Texas is not a state that makes teachers have benchmarks or short-term objectives for all their goals. Only the students that take those alternate assessment. But I know some states you do. You automatically have to set up those benchmarks or short-term objectives. But according to IDEA, it only has to happen for those students that are going to take that alternate assessment. So if your state makes you do it anyways, then you're just kind of going above and beyond what IDEA says, which is fine. That's what Amy talked about earlier. Okay, so when you're writing those goals, you want to make sure, number one, you're focusing on student behavior, not the educator behavior. So it's what we want the student to do, not what we want the teacher to do. Make sure you're monitoring those with enough frequency to determine that if you're making the progress that you need to make to reach that annual goal by the end of the year. And if not, maybe you need to make some decisions about instructional or interventions that need to change to help that student meet that goal. Because you don't really ever want to, if you can help it, you never want to lower that goal. You never want to, just because the student's not on track to meet that goal, you don't want to make the goal easier for the student if you can help it. You want to increase the supports to help the student move, catch up and move towards that goal. You want to make sure goals are going to be measured using an objective, valid, and reliable measure. So some things that we list there, like a direct behavior rating, you're gonna see some examples of goals in a minute that reference that direct behavior rating, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get to that example. But there's some more other examples that you want to use an objective, valid, reliable measure more than just you don't want to just use a subjective measure. So you don't want to just use you don't want to just have a teacher saying, yeah, he's doing great. Okay, well, but what does that mean? Yeah, he's doing great. Is he on track? Is he meeting his goal already? Is he already above? Is he way below? Like just saying, yeah, he's doing great doesn't give you enough information. You want to make sure you can graph that data and actually see on that graph if they're on target to meet that goal. The last thing there is kind of a hard line to walk. It's being realistic versus being ambitious. So you definitely want to make ambitious goals, but you also want to make realistic goals. You don't want to set it so high that it would be very hard for that student to meet that goal. But you don't want to set it so low either that it's too easy for that student to reach the goal. You want to set an ambitious goal, but you want to be realistic. That's why data and teacher expertise is so important, and having that group, that IEP team, talk about that student to make sure you're making a goal that is realistic and ambitious, and not just somebody just guessing it or just one person having input on what that goal should be. All right. So did you know that a single goal could address multiple needs outlined in the PLAF statement? So you're going to see an example here at the bottom. So for example, an oral reading fluency goal related to reading proficiency might support students who needs related to sight words, phonics, and fluency. So basically what this means is, say you have a student who's getting instruction, specially designed instruction, who's getting intervention in sight words, phonics, and fluency. You don't necessarily have to have a goal that addresses all three of those things individually, sight words, phonics, and fluency. You could have an oral reading fluency goal that kind of addresses all those at the same time. Because if a student's increasing their oral reading fluency, it means they're also increasing they're probably increasing their sight word, their ability to read sight words, their ability to use phonics, their ability to read more fluently. So if all those things are being worked on, in interventions and in instruction, you could probably just have that one goal, and you would see that if the student is making progress because of those or not. All right, so on our tip sheet that we showed you earlier, we talked into more depth about what these three essential elements are of a measurable annual goal. So the three things there are target behavior, condition, and level of proficiency and timeline. So to hit each one of those individually. So target behavior is basically, what do we want the student to learn? What do we need the student to learn? What are we trying to get the student to learn? That's the target behavior. A condition is, when do we expect that student to show that target behavior? Under what conditions? So an example would be when reading a third grade passage. That could be the condition where we have that target behavior set up. Or during math class, that could be another condition of when that student is supposed to display that target behavior. The last thing there is level of proficiency and timeline. So we kind of have those together because sometimes it makes sense to give a level of proficiency. Like you may say something like they will achieve something with 80% proficiency on 3 out of 10 or three tries in a row or something like that. Or you may say by the end of the semester, the student will do this. Or sometimes it makes sense to say both of those things. So that's kind of why we have them together there. Is you could use just one by itself, level of proficiency or timeline, or you could have both of those together. But all three of these things need to be in place to have a measurable annual goal. All right, on the next slide, we're going to start looking at some examples. So this is an academic goal example. Okay, so let's look at this example. So we're going to see kind of a draft goal, and then we're going to see, does this draft goal have those three parts of a goal that we need it to have? All right, so here's our draft goal. It says Jesse will read 65 words per minute. Okay, so when we think back at our essential elements of goals, like, so we're going to look, does this have a condition? Does this have a target behavior? And does this have a level of proficiency or timeline? Okay, so let's look at condition first. Do we think it has a condition? Is it telling us when we need Jesse to read 55 or how we want him to read 55 or 65 words per minute? All right, so I would say that this does not have a condition on it. We don't know. Like, do we want Jesse to read a second grade reading passage, an eighth grade reading passage, a fourth grade reading passage? We don't know because they don't tell us what that condition is. We don't know what is expected of Jesse. Okay. Target behavior. Jesse will read 65 words per minute. That's probably a pretty good target behavior. Okay. I think we could probably write it a little bit better, and you'll see the example of how we can rewrite this goal here in a minute. But we would say we would go ahead and give this credit for having a target behavior there. Okay, the last thing there, level proficiency of our timeline. So we say we'll read 65 words per minute. So I don't think that's a clear enough level of proficiency, and they don't give a timeline for sure. So I would say we don't have that element. We don't have a level of proficiency or a timeline there. So of those three elements, we really only have a target behavior, which I think could probably be written a little bit better. So let's see, once we revise this goal a little bit, let's see what it could look like if we give a little more information and include all of our elements there. So the revised goal would be, given a second grade reading probe, Jesse will read 65 words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. Okay, so let's go through our conditions on that real quick. So given a second grade reading passage, so that's our condition, right? So we know now what is expected of Jesse. We're expecting him to read a second grade reading passage. Okay, so we still have there our target behavior. Jesse will read 65 words correctly in 1 minute. So that's still there a little bit, but we kind of clarified it a little bit by saying we want them to read those words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. So sometimes when I present this, people are confused, like, why are you saying they'll read 65 words read correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes? The reason we word it that way is because if you give Jesse a second grade reading probe and he could just go through and pick out 65 words from that passage that he could read. I mean, he may just go through and say, the, and, but, he, did, go, and then just read 65 words that he knows he can read. But he's not really reading the passage. He's not reading the story. That's kind of that's our ultimate goal, is for our student to be able to read a passage and get information from that passage, right? So that's why we add this little extra read those 65 words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy, because he's going to read the passage and read as much as he can in 1 minute. Hopefully he will read 65 words correctly in that amount that he reads. But overall, we want him to also read with 95% accuracy. So we know that he's making sense of that passage. And then we put on there on 3 consecutive probes. So that's kind of like when we know he can do that 3 times in a row, 3 consecutive probes, then we can say that he's met that goal. All right, so let's look at an example about a functional goal. So remember, functional goals help to increase that participation or independence in the general education curriculum or setting. So different than those academic things where it's reading, writing, math, science, things like that. These are those functional skills that we talked about earlier. So a draft functional goal could be something like, during each 40-minute class, Jose will pay attention and be engaged 95% of the time. Okay, so let's think about our 3 essential elements of goals, and let's see if we have each one of these here. So remember condition. So condition lets us know, when do we expect Jose to show this target behavior? So in our goal, we say during each 40-minute class. So it's telling us. So that's a good condition. We're saying during each 40-minute class, we want him to follow this, to pay attention and be engaged. All right, so target behavior. So we have something, kind of like a target behavior. We say pay attention and be engaged. The reason we want to put a question mark here is because what does that mean? What does that mean, pay attention and be engaged? Okay, so we're going to talk more about that in a minute once we see our revised goal. But pay attention and be engaged may not be enough information for somebody to be able to measure this goal, right? The last thing there, level of proficiency or the timeline, we have 95% of the time there. And so I'm going to put a question mark there as well. Okay, the reason is because first of all, think about if that makes sense for that student. Because think about just any kid in your class. Does any kid pay attention, or do most kids pay attention 95% of the time? So if it's not something that's meaningful or makes sense for that student, then we shouldn't make that as the level of proficiency. If it doesn't make sense that hardly any student probably doesn't pay attention 95% of the time, why would we expect Jose to pay attention 95% of the time? Okay. So if we look at a revised version of this goal, let's talk through this a little bit. So during each 40-minute class period, Jose will remain academically engaged at least 70% of the day of the class for 5 consecutive days, as monitored by daily DBRs. And if you remember, a DBR stands for direct behavior rating. Okay, so let me explain that a little bit first of all. So direct behavior ratings are they're I believe they're free to use if you go to the website about direct behavior ratings. And what those do is they actually define what they mean by paying attention or being engaged or showing respect. So they have some examples about like what that could look like. So they're saying if a student is paying attention in class, it means they are actively working on their work. They're raising their hand to ask questions. They're speaking to peers when, during group work. Whatever, there's some, they have, like I say, they have some that are already kind of made up for that you can use, but they also have some blank ones that you can define what that means for that student. Like what do you and what does the IEP team agree that, what does that mean, paying attention and being engaged or academically engaged? What does that mean for Jose? And as long as everybody knows what that means, then you can accurately gather some data about that if everyone knows what that means and if Jose understands what that means. Okay, and you notice there at least 70% of the class, that we kind of lowered that that percentage there. So to get a percentage like that, what you'd want to do is do some observations in the class that Jose's in. See what some other typical students do, and then once you take some data on maybe 2 or 3 or 4 other students in that class and say like, okay, I took data on four other kiddos. They're all staying engaged about 70 to 75% of the time. So maybe a more realistic goal for Jose is that we want him to pay attention 70% of the class, because that's kind of the normal, for peers his age. Okay, so instead of just blindly saying 95%, or I see a lot on IEP goals, they just magically put everything's going to happen at 80% proficiency. So don't just automatically put 85 or 80%. See what makes sense for that student. If they're starting at 5%, would it make sense to say 80% is where you want to get to? Would it make more sense for them to maybe say 40% or whatever makes sense? All I'm saying is don't just put a blind percentage and just say 80% for everything when that may not make sense for that student. All right. So let's go to our, when we're talking about our annual goals, we want to make sure we want to keep those fair. So this is an acronym that stands for feasible, acceptable, impactful, and relevant. So what we mean by feasible is we want to make sure, again, that it's ambitious given the student's circumstances, but can it realistically be achieved? Like for that example we just saw, is it realistic to give Jose the 95% being actively engaged? Does that make sense? Can you realistically achieve that goal? Okay, so keep that in mind when you're making your goals. Acceptable, is the goal acceptable to the student, the family, and the educators on the IEP team? Is it something that they agree that needs to be worked on and is going to make a difference for Jose as far as, or for any student, for making progress in that general education curriculum? The next thing there, impactful. Will achieving the goal positively impact the student's access and benefit from the general education curriculum and other educational outcomes? So if it's something that, if it's a goal that is helping one of those primary needs, then hopefully, yes, that would be impactful for student. But that's also why we don't want 20 goals for a student as well. We don't need every one of those needs in the PLAF may not need a goal. So we want to make sure when we do set up a goal, is that something that's going to really impact that student and to benefit from the general education curriculum and outcomes. The last one there, relevant. Does the goal connect to meaningful outcome for the student and his or her family? So does it make sense for the student? Does it make sense for the family? Is it something they see as important for that student to work on, to have a goal on, and to have services on to help achieve that goal? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this is just one more time, just to kind of reemphasize how all these fit together. So we talked a lot about our IEP goals. Those IEP goals are helping a student to achieve closer to or at grade level in their curriculum so they can make grade level progress. Those two things together will hopefully help the student perform better on those national and state accountability measures that every student will be a part of. But really, those three things together are going to help you know, is that student on track to have that post-school success, whether going to higher education, going to get a job, going to maybe live more independently, whatever that post-school success, those three things before are going to help you know, are you on track, or is that student on track to meet that post-school success? All right, so here's our graphic again that kind of shows how all the parts work and interact together. So again, that statement of services and aids, those are going to be the things that, again, whatever the annual goals are set up from the PLAF statement is going to have all the needs. The annual goals are going to address some of those needs. The statement of services and aids are going to be all that education, the specially designed instruction, the accommodations, the other services and aids that student needs to make progress on those goals, but also will address other needs in the PLAF that may not need goals, but are still need to be addressed somehow. So that's how all these this parts work together. So this is that statement of services and aids that we're trying to set up the services that student needs to make progress on their goals and to make progress in their general education curriculum. All right, so remember, and I think we've said this several times already today, all students are general education students first. So some students just require special education aids and services to access and benefit from the general education similarly to their peers. So, but again, 80% of students receiving special education services spend 80% of their time in the general education setting. So they're general education students first, and then they just may need some of those special education aids and services to help them in their general education setting. All right, so there's 4 parts to the statement of services and aids. And in a minute, we'll see a video that kind of shows how they work together. And again, we have a tip sheet about this, about the statement of services and aids. And actually, we have several tip sheets about the statement of services and aids. We have one that's going to give an overview of the statement of services and aids overall. And then we also have individual tip sheets that address each of these 4 parts that give you more information about each of those. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of each of these 4 parts. One of them is that first one there is special education. So special education is just another way of saying specially designed instruction. So what is the specially designed instruction that student needs to address those goals and to make progress in their general education setting? The second thing there, related services. So some of the more common related services that we think about are like physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech services, transportation. So the key about a related service is that related service is supposed to help the student make progress or access their special education. So that's one of the key things to remember about related services, or that some people don't realize, is that those related services help the student make progress and make gains and access their special education. That's why transportation is considered a related service. That's getting the student to school to be able to access their special education. And Amy put the tip sheets in the chat if you want to click on that link to see them. The third one there, supplementary aids and services. So the common things there that we think about are accommodations and modifications. Those are the 2 main things that kind of fit under that supplementary aids and services. But those are generally used in the general education setting. They can be used anywhere. Like a student can use an accommodation anywhere that it's needed, but really it's mostly for access to that general education setting and to make sure that they have the same access and can benefit as other students without a disability. The last one there is the one that's probably the least talked about, the ones I see the least about whenever I see IEPs from different schools, but that's program modifications or supports for school personnel. So what that means is, because that's the one that's almost, well, part of that is not, it doesn't really directly help the student. It's what does the staff do that can help the student. So does the staff need more training on something? Does the staff need special time to get together to talk about that student? So that's the support for school personnel. Program modifications kind of get confused with the modifications that are included in the supplementary aids and services. The modifications in supplementary aids and services are modifications to the student's curriculum. Like, what are they doing something differently than other students their age? Like, for example, if there's a math worksheet and the math worksheet includes multiplication, division, adding and subtracting problems, then a modification may be this student is only responsible for the addition and subtraction parts because that's what their IEP says. So they're not responsible for all the multiplication and division on that page. So that's a modification to what that student's expected to do. A program modification is there some kind of physical change that needs to happen to the school? Like does it need to be a room arranged a certain way? Do they need some sort of special device to get around the school or something like that? Or it could also mean, like, does there need to be a change in that student's schedule? Do they need to come to school later in the day? Do they need to leave earlier in the day for whatever reason? So those are a little more rare, than supplementary aids and services. So, but it's something that probably isn't discussed enough. And even though every student won't need every one of these things every time, every student won't need all 4 of these things in every one of their IEPs. But the thing is, you have to discuss it. You have to talk about, does the student need this or not? Does the student need something to address in supplementary aids and services or related services? And if not, then they don't. But at least one of these areas have to be addressed in every IEP. And usually it's the special education. Usually every student needs specially designed instruction, but they may need services in these other areas as well. Okay, on the next slide, please. All right, so this is the video that's going to show us how the statement of services and aids, a way to think about it is to think about a symphony, and how all the instruments work together is a way to think about the statement of services and aids, how all those parts should work together for the student.
We'll begin your journey into the statement of services and aids with a quick analogy. Think of the IEP's statement of services and aids as a symphony orchestra, where every instrument represents a unique type of support or assistance given to a student with a disability. Just like a beautifully orchestrated musical performance, the services and aids listed in the student's IEP work together harmoniously to ensure students can fully engage in the general education curriculum and extracurricular activities to the maximum extent appropriate. Picture each aid or service as a distinct instrument in the orchestra. In an orchestra, every instrument plays a crucial yet unique role. Similarly, each part of the statement of services and aids plays a vital role in addressing the students' specific needs and paving the way for their progress in school. Understanding each component of the statement helps IEP teams develop and document specialized instruction, aids, and services that will make a real difference in the student's progress. Just like musicians in an orchestra, it's essential for the providers of these services to coordinate their efforts, share information, and align their strategies. This ensures a comprehensive and effective educational program that promotes student access to and benefit from the general curriculum. Just as musicians synchronize their playing, follow the conductor's cues, and support one another's contributions, the various aids and services outlined in the Statement of Services and Aids must work in perfect harmony to support the student's needs. By working together, these services create a powerful educational experience that supports the needs of the student. So let's celebrate the wonderful symphony of support that the Statement of Services and Aids brings to the IEP process. It's a true masterpiece that helps students with disabilities reach their unique potential in school and beyond.
All right. So yeah, that video shows us how all those parts, just like in the whole IEP needs to work together, all those parts in the statement of services and aids need to work together for the student as well. All right, so there's a picture of the tip sheet that we have about the overview of the statement of services and aids, and you'll see those 4 parts are addressed there on this IEP. I mean, sorry, this tip sheet. But there's also individual tip sheets for each of those that you can click on. But what IDEA says about the Statement of Services and Aids is that it's a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child, and a statement of the program modifications or supports. So it's a very weirdly and worded sentence and maybe sometimes hard to understand. But you see, we highlighted, we bolded there each of those 4 areas: the special education, related services, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications or supports. So all 4 of those areas have to at least be considered for each student, and then they may need supports in each of those or not. I know, so many ands, right, Amy? And so to emphasize more about what IDEA says is what they want the statement of services aids, or what it's for, is to help the students advance appropriately towards attaining those annual goals. Remember our graphic, how the annual goals are connected to the statement of services and aids. Be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities. So again, some of those services and aids will help students achieve goals. Sometimes they may just help the student be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum. And last thing there, to be educated and participate with other children with disabilities and non-disabled children in the activities described in this section. So again, access, giving them access to all the things that a non-disabled student would also have access to. All right, so let's look at this did you know. So on the left, it says, the purpose of modifications or accommodations is to increase access to the general education curriculum that a child, because of a disability, cannot access alone. Okay, but what IDEA says is that an accommodation or modification is not sufficient for progress. These should be paired with specially designed instruction to the extent appropriate to reduce the need for these supplementary aids and services. So what this is saying is just giving a student an accommodation or a modification is not enough. You know, that does help them access the general education curriculum, but that needs to be paired with specially designed instruction, because the idea is hopefully as the student increases their skills and gains more knowledge and gains more skills, you can reduce those accommodations and modifications, and then a student may not need those anymore. Now, there's some things that a student may always need. For example, like a student with a vision impairment may always need large print books. That's just something that may always happen. But the idea is that some accommodations and some modifications may go away as they gain those skills. They may not need those as much anymore. That's why you have to revisit those every year. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here's just an example of a student and how the areas of services and aids could be for that student with a certain disability. Oh, that's a good point, Amy. If that student, to explain Amy's point in the chat, is if a student only needs accommodations or modifications, then they could be served under Section 504. If a student isn't getting any kind of specially designed instruction, then they don't meet the qualifications as a student under IDEA. They could get served those accommodations and modifications through Section 504. So that kind of clarifies what Amy's saying there in the chat. Okay, so if you look at one statement of services and aids for a student, so this is a 6th grade student with a learning disability that impacts the student's ability to decode and fluently read connected text. Okay, so as far as special education and specially designed instruction, they're getting daily 30-minute direct instruction in phonics and reading fluency taught by the special education teacher. So that's their specially designed instruction. That's their special education that they're receiving. Related service, they could get speech services to address the dysfluency and stutter impacting fluent reading of connected text. So that's their related service is speech. Supplementary aids and services, they get access to an audiobook or a peer reader, because again, that's helping them to access that general education curriculum and setting better. And then the last thing there, program modifications or support for school personnel, is a special education teacher meets 30 minutes each month with the speech and language pathologist to ensure that speech services assist the student in benefiting from special education. So it's in the IEP that those two, the teacher and the speech pathologist, should meet 30 minutes each month to make sure that those services are aligned for that student. So this is just an example of how each of the areas of the statement of services and aids were addressed for this student. All right, so this is another graph that kind of shows how the statement of services and aids all kind of fit together to achieve that school and post-school success. Okay, so again, remember, related services, those are supposed to help that student benefit from special education. That's why you see related services directly with an arrow to special education. And then the special education and the supplementary aids and services are both used to help that student have access and to make progress in the general education curriculum. That's why the arrows are kind of meeting there. Underneath everything there, the program modifications or supports for school personnel, remember that could be affect all those areas. That could be training teachers need. That could be special circumstances, how the school or the time that students in school is set up. So that's why it kind of affects all of those areas. But the ultimate goal is for all those to help access and progress in the general education curriculum so they can meet those school and post-school successes that we've been talking about as our progress for students with disabilities. All right, next slide. There you go. Okay. So that wraps up our statement of services and aids. So before I send it over to Amy to kind of wrap us up for the day, any questions in the chat or anybody want to say out loud? I think I saw something in the chat. It says, can you briefly discuss modifications of the program as being different from modifying the standards for those working on alternate benchmarks? Okay, so that's what I was trying to kind of explain that, Michael, is if you're altering what the student is learning, that's a modification, right? So whether you're altering, either you're reducing the things the students what they're learning as far as the state standards, or you're reducing what they're accountable for when they're doing work. A program modification is, how are you adjusting that student's, maybe their school day? Are you having them go to school for less amount of days, or are you arranging their schedule a certain way to make sure that they benefit from the education and learning? So it's a difference between modifying the curriculum versus modifying like what what the environment for the student is like. Yeah, and Amy should put some
I do think
clarification as well.
if you're modifying the full curriculum programming for the student and all of the standards for the student, that would probably fall under that program modifications lens.
Okay.
But if it's a specific like focus area in an instruction like that you're providing, I think Stephen, you talked about it before on like a worksheet or a test or something like that. That would be more in the piece around the instructional modifications as part of the state or supplementary aids and services. And to throw a deeper loop in there, if for folks that are interested in the specially designed instruction, of course, we also can modify, the content and the delivery and the modification as part of our specially designed instruction as well. So we just like to use modification in lots of different ways here.
All right. Well, if some other question comes up, even while Amy's kind of wrapping us up here, I will be monitoring the chat as well, and I'll try to respond to those. But I'm going to turn it back over to Amy so she can take us home for the day.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you all for hanging with us. I know this is a long chunk of time and it's a long day. So we've got about 30 minutes or so, but I don't know if we'll take that whole time. So we might give you back a couple minutes here at the end if possible. So just want to bring it together with some of kind of our big takeaways, our big messages, and then also think through some of the key resources and highlight some of those that you can use and leverage for your work as you go forward. So Stephen talked about this from the very start, but thinking about bringing it back to FAPE or the free appropriate public education, thinking about are we ensuring that our IEPs have all of the procedural compliance components in there? Do we have all the parts of the IEP? Do we have the correct team members for our IEP? Have we met our timelines? Have we met our procedures for communication with parents and families and all of those pieces? Have we really thought about all of that? That is a critical part, right? We have to make sure that we are doing what the law says related to the procedures. And then we want to think bigger picture too to the substantive. So really thinking about the substantive, thinking about kind of whether or not it's reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress, right? So when we think about the knowing the student and the PLAF and really identifying the needs, we want to make sure that we can clearly outline the student's needs so that then we can develop programming that's appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Without a strong present level statement that really outlines the child's circumstances, we can't design a program that will support them in order to make progress, right? So thinking about kind of being very clear there around knowing the student, knowing the needs, and really thinking about designing our programming based on those needs, making sure that we're looking for the connections between those different parts of the IEP, as you saw in those many, many arrow graphics that have been part of this presentation to date. And then Stephen talked about the implementation piece at the beginning as well. We can design something really great. Maybe it's procedurally compliant and substantively meaningful, but if we're not implementing the IEP and the instructional services outlined in the IEP, if we don't actually put it into practice, we don't have the capacity as educators in order to do that, we don't have the resources to do that, then the student's not actually going to get that benefit. If we think back to that original equation that Stephen talked about, that's really a critical component. And we see a little bit more and more in case law kind of coming out around this implementation piece in FAPE. So we don't have a Supreme Court case, right, yet around the implementation piece like we do, kind of thinking about the key components in the Rowley decision and the Andrew decision, thinking about the helping us understand the substantive. But we are really thinking about kind of how do we ensure FAPE by thinking about the implementation phase of FAPE as well. And as we think about kind of these different procedural and substantive and so on, we can think back to the bike that we talked about at the beginning, making sure that we have all of the required parts. We can outline all of these pieces, and you can see this graphic here. It was part of the video that we saw earlier of the parts just by themselves. We could have really great parts of a bicycle. And if we have any cyclists here, you probably know all about all these different parts, but we could have a really great frame, a carbon fiber frame. We could have really wonderful gears and wheels and handlebars and the fork and all of these parts. But if they're just sitting apart and they're not working together, just like we could have a really nicely written present level statement and a really great outline statement of services and aids that really include our thoughts about our specially designed instruction, our special education, our supplementary aids and services, and so on. But if they're not connected, we're not going to get that meaningful IEP that we can really use to drive our instruction and drive access and progress for the student. So thinking about kind of the procedural piece, like these parts of the bike, we want to have high quality parts. We don't really want a flat tire, right? We want to make sure that we have the parts together and that we've cleaned our bike parts and all of that. But we also want to make sure that, as we see on the next slide, that they all come together to have a bike that we could actually ride on and move forward and think about it as a vehicle for progress. So thinking about how the different parts line up and work together. So our PLAF statement drives the development of our goals, and our statement of services and aids, and our monitoring of the statement of services and aids and our progress toward our goals helps us to understand whether the services we developed are effective for the student or if we need to do something else. And for folks that are interested in diving into that a little bit further, tomorrow in the concurrent sessions, there's a session around data-based individualization and specially designed instruction, and how we can really think about that ongoing data collection, individualization process, and adaptations over time to really ensure that we're developing a program that is most effective for the student and that they can make progress and help them to access and progress in the general curriculum. So we want to make sure all those parts move together. And then we want to make sure we can think about it in this arrow format too, right? So we've talked about this many times already, and you can see those pieces. One of the things we never really talked about, but you might have noticed in this graphic, is kind of the relationship between the statement of services and aids, as well as the participation outside of regular education and in state and district-wide assessments, and the date, frequency, location of services, and so on. And we kind of group those together because they really also work together in order to help us create that program, right? So understanding the services and aids that the student needs helps us to understand the best environment for those services to be delivered and what that means for access to instruction, but also access to the assessments. And if there are any accommodations within assessments or things like that we need to take into account as well. So we want to make sure that we're really thinking about how all these pieces work together and how all these arrows kind of go back and forth, and it's a living document, breathing document, right? It's not a one and done, we put it on the shelf and we move forward. We really use this as an iterative tool to help ensure that the IEP is the best it can be. So one of the tools that we have on the Progress Center website, along with the Knowing the Student activity that we talked about before, is this Looking for Connections resource. And this here, you can see the facilitator's guide, but this is just kind of a simple way to facilitate a conversation or a TA activity with a group of educators to really look at an IEP and to make sure that we can think about how the needs we identify in the present level statement impact the goals that impact our statement of services and aids, and vice versa, by looking at and highlighting the unique needs in different colors, and then making the connections to the statement of services aids and to the goals to make sure that we can find those connections across our IEPs. So there is a facilitator's guide available for you, as well as a participant packet that you can use to really facilitate this activity. One of our big lessons learned around this is sometimes it's really beneficial to start with a mock example or a basic example, so that people don't feel kind of that ownership over an IEP that they have designed or developed themselves. Maybe there's an example one that you can use to help people make the connections, and then they can use that same tool and same process in order to refine and revise their own IEP, right? Because we want to make sure that it's, if we think back to the assumptions kind of piece that we talked about, that Riley talked about, is that we aren't adding additional context to the IEPs that are being developed that somebody who just picks it up and takes it won't have, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking critically across the components there and being able to make those connections. So that's a resource there that you can use and tap into. And then it also includes a reflection activity to really help people to understand that extent that the needs clearly are identified in the class statement, and whether or not those needs are then connected to the goals and the proposed services and so on. So just making sure to check kind of the parts there to make those connections over time. One of the other things that Stephen mentioned from the very start, and we talked about this morning, is that we don't just have the IEP itself. We really have it within the context of the systems and supports that we have to build our instructional programming to help students be successful. And so we want to think about the educator supports that are necessary, how we're really thinking about student belonging, how we're thinking about both access to the effective curriculum, general curriculum, as well as the individualized instructions and supports that are needed. And we want to think about how we're all working collectively together, that intentional staff collaboration, in order to help students move forward for progress. So when we go back to this bike example, right, we think about, a lot of times, you might have a bike in your closet or in your garage that you don't use very frequently. We don't take it out for the ride. That's not helpful for us. That comes back to that implementation piece. We need to make sure that it's available to be ridden on, that it doesn't have flat tires, that we've really taken care of the bike along the way. But we also want to make sure that we are keeping our roads or our paths or whatever it is clear so that we can go out for our bike ride and be effective and enjoy it as we move forward, right? So we want to think about these supports that we need to put in place in our systems in order to allow us to do that. So just to wrap up with a couple places to go for resources on the website. If you're not familiar with the Progress Center website, you can join and visit it at promotingprogress.org. There's a QR code here on the screen for you to be able to use to get right to that homepage. Many of you probably got there either to register or anything like that. But there's also a request support button, which you can see up in the top hand corner. If you have trouble accessing a resource, or you're looking for something and you can't find it that we talked about, or you need some additional support, go ahead and feel free to reach out through that request support email there or contact form on the website, and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. I know our email box is probably full of requests for certificates at this point, so it might take us a couple seconds to get through that, but feel free at any point if you need additional support to reach out to us to really move this work forward. And then a couple of the other key resources that I just want to point out here on the website that we talked about today. We talked about this IEP tip sheet series. We saw the overview of the IEP tip sheet and did a deep dive there, but we have ones, as I mentioned before, around the present level statement, around measurable annual goals, measuring progress toward those goals, and so on. So all of those different components of the IEP, we have them there. You can also see tip sheets there around transition services and age of majority. And as Stephen mentioned, for the overview of the Statement of Services and Aids, there's a series of sub-tip sheets that relate to each of those components that we talked about as part of the Statement of Services and Aids. So one around supplementary aids and services, one around related services, one around what is special education and specially designed instruction, and then one really focused on the program modifications and supports for school personnel. So those are all available. I mentioned before as well that there's a couple that are designed specifically for parents, and then there are also versions of, I think, pretty much all of these available in Spanish as well. One of the newer resources that we are in the process of releasing, and so we're constantly adding to this collection as well, is a series of disability category tip sheets. And this was really intended to really help people to understand how does IDEA define the different disability categories that you might be thinking about, some key terms related to those different disability categories and how they may impact a student, as well as some strategies to successfully supporting those students. So we have some of the disability categories posted on the website. We are still working through a couple of them, so they will be coming soon, and come and check back on that page for all of those additional ones as they come out as well. And then in addition to all of that, if you want to return to any of this content at any point, we have a series of self-paced courses that are available on the website. One of the key ones that really relate to this content is you can see there is the IEP self-paced course collection, but there's also a series around special education law collection, as well as evidence-based instructional practices. Under the IEP self-paced courses, there are modules, and these tend to be about 30 minutes long, and they're interactive, and you can really engage with the content, learn it, share it with others. There are modules related to the IEP team, as well as to developing a PLAF statement and measurable annual goals and the statement of services and aids. So those are all available there. They are included or in our Moodle platform. And so they, if you take one of these courses, you have to sign up and register for the Moodle platform in order to be able to then get a certificate of completion for any of those modules that you take. So you can get that credit for taking those modules. I know there's a lot of other content on there. There's webinars, there's other things. If you watch a recording, there's no way for us to know that you've actually done it. So these are a nice way for you to be able to get credit, a certificate of completion for any of those resources that you engage with there. Dr. Perry Zerkel helped us with the special education law courses, and some of those are really about the foundations of law, even more globally than special education. I think like it helped me to really understand kind of the layers of the law, and so they might be helpful for you to think about kind of what does it mean for students with disabilities within the context of the larger special education law, both the IDEA as well as other laws that impact students with disabilities, and then also thinking about kind of the levels of the law and really thinking about case law versus other levels of the law and the Supreme Court decisions and so on, and what does it mean for precedents in different contexts and situations. So those are great. And then the evidence-based course collection really go into different practices to dig deeper around effective practices to support students with disabilities across disability categories and so on that have been found through the research. Many of these we've looked at already, so just re-highlighting a couple here for you. These are all the TA-related activities to support IEP development. So getting to know your IEP, digging deeper into that, looking for the connections that we just talked about. The strategies for analyzing Progress Center IEP tip sheets helps you to facilitate that process that we looked at when we looked at the overview of the IEP tip sheet. So if you wanted to run an activity with the different tip sheets with a group of educators you work with, you could use that facilitator guide to help you with that. And then the Knowing Your Student activity, which we ran virtually, but you can also run face-to-face there to engage with deeper as well. And then, as I mentioned before, there are resources to engage parents and families as partners in the IEP development. There are a range of OSEP investments to help support parents and families as well. Great resources from our Parent Center partners. These are just a couple resources that have been developed, oftentimes in partnership or in review by Parent Center partners as well. So the IEP overview, as well as the IEP team tip sheets, and then there's a guide for helping parents engage with an IEP meeting. And then I think on the next slide shows some examples of some forms that you can use to engage with parents and students, as Riley mentioned, prior to an IEP meeting to get some information and resources about kind of the goals for the future or things they want to accomplish this year. What has worked well in the past? What hasn't worked well in the past to really help inform that work. Again, you can feel free to take and adapt and use these kind of tools and materials for your context based on your needs. You might have different strategies, or maybe you have other ways that you're collecting this information. But if you don't and you want to use any of these materials, feel free to do that to engage with parents and families and students prior to an IEP. Great. So I'm seeing kind of the connection with the bike parts and really thinking about the bike. That was actually, it came from our project officer helped us really think through this bike analogy very early in our project. We had gone down a road maybe of a car or other things, but kind of came back around to the parts being similar to a bike. Yeah, and I see it. lots of tip sheets, use and strategies, the resources. Yeah, hopefully, I'm sure we've overwhelmed you with the resources. I know that tends to be the case, but hopefully you'll have a little bit of time to digest and take a look at those. So as you keep adding your intentions into the chat here, I'm going to have Riley turn over to the next slide, and we're just going to wrap up with a short video. And this is one of our stories from the classroom video series that really looks at kind of why we do the work that we do. What are some of the things that we need to think about as we focus in on this work and the work that we talked about in the opening session with student belonging and helping a student feel engaged and successful. So I'm going to let Zuann take it away in the video, and then I'll just share at the very end our next steps for tomorrow, and then we'll be done for today.
Stories from the classroom, finding belonging. Meet Sue Ann, a young adult recalling her school experiences.
Grade school was tough. You know, my peers would be playing basketball or running track or whatever, and I would just sit on the sidelines. I just mainly watched. Some of my gym teachers would, when we played basketball, they would give me like a ball and let me throw it into a little bucket or something. But it's still like, I still felt like I was the odd one. I didn't feel included, and I didn't feel like, I just felt left out. I was a pretty independent kid, and I was also a pretty prideful kid. And I didn't want to ask for help unless I was drowning. And then when I was drowning, it was too late.
While attending a youth conference with members of her church, Sue Ann heard a speaker discussing depression among students across America. She thought, he's talking about me. It was so powerful to her that she knew right then and there that she wanted to step out of her depression.
From then on, I really fought to change my identity. I'm not this disabled person. I am loved, and I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and I tell myself this, and it's just done so much for my confidence.
Soon after, her youth pastor tried to include her in an activity. She was so used to staying on the outside and not being included that she whispered to her cousin and asked her cousin to tell him that she couldn't do it. To which he said, "Why can't she?"
I just remember that phrase, "Why can't she?" And that really stuck with me, like, why can't I do this? Why can't I do whatever everyone else does? And so I think it's just having those people. It doesn't need to be a lot of people, but just those key figures in my life that really speak words of life and words of wisdom. And because as a person with disabilities, I get the word no all the time. And it's just so refreshing when someone says, you can do this. You just have to figure out another way.
Sue Ann is now finishing her master's in social work while serving on the university's Disability Advisory Board and running a student organization called Indivisible that centers around disabilities.
That gift that each one of us has, it's not just for us. It's for other people too.
So hopefully that helped you to kind of think outside the bounds of, the day-to-day work, the IEP paperwork. We can really think about how to use and leverage the IEP to create that sense of, yes, you can do this. And how can we think about the strategies and supports necessary in order to allow students to thrive and be successful and feel like they belong in their school communities. And so really taking kind of her message to heart. She is no longer a student in social work. She is now a full-fledged social worker doing this work in the field, supporting others. And so thinking about kind of how you can use, her story, but all of your stories and the work that you do every day with students to really move this work forward, to help, center the student as we develop the IEP, to really think about kind of what their goals are for the future, and then really design backwards with the end in mind, thinking about their ultimate plans and how we can get them the strategies and supports necessary in order to be successful.